Welcome to this podcast of the League of American Orchestras, one in a series of conversations exploring the innovative practices described in Fearless Journeys, Innovation in Five American Orchestras. I'm Catherine Maciariello, your host for this discussion. Published by the League in June 2010, Fearless Journeys takes us inside five creative organizations: the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, the Pacific Symphony, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and the Memphis Symphony Orchestra, showing how they reframed their problems and challenges, developed new strategies and pathways to success, built collaborative cultures, and found powerful new ways to engage their communities. Fearless Journeys was made possible by a generous grant from the MetLife Foundation with additional support from the National Endowment for the Arts. The book is available as a downloadable PDF as well as for Kindle and EPUB from the League's website at americanorchestras.org. In this podcast, I'm joined by Deborah Borda, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and Chad Smith, Vice President of Artistic Planning. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Let's just start with a little bit of background, and then we'll get into the discussion. Fearless Journeys describes what's nothing less than a complete reimagining of the Philharmonic over the past decade, from the organization's business model to its programming and its approach to engaging audiences. The Philharmonic always has been dedicated to new music and programmatic experimentation, but historically its decisions didn't necessarily lead to financial stability. In fact, just the opposite. Yet despite some pretty rocky times, the organization's focused effort in recent years, leading up to and following the opening of Walt Disney Concert Hall, has created new energy around the purposeful interface of programming, business management, and audience building. The result is that today, the Philharmonic is incredibly interesting artistically and fundamentally stable financially. So let's talk a little bit about how that happened. Deborah, you in particular have often talked about the Philharmonic's deeply held artistic and philosophical position about music. For the sake of people who may not yet have read Fearless Journeys, could you describe how your fundamental beliefs inform and drive the process as you sit down to plan a season?
Well, there are two basic core values that we hold dear to our hearts and that we test everything against. And those two values are innovation and excellence. And we hold that test and that mirror up to every decision that we make within the institution. And basically, using that kind of test also employed the opening and the opportunity that Walt Disney Concert Hall provided to us in 2003, as you say, to, in a way, reinvent or reimagine the institution. It's many people say, how can I think we're well known for doing a tremendous amount of contemporary music, a real spectrum of undertakings, our festival programming. I see that you call it identity programming in Fearless Journeys. And so some people might think, well, this is something that doesn't attract audiences. But in fact, we found that when we held to our really deeply held artistic values, and also I would add into this the value of contemporary music as being part of our lives, not something that is on the side. And when we applied those across the board, it was an opportunity for us. And today, as you say, I think the institution is thriving artistically. It is known for its innovative practices, and we're also extremely healthy financially.
Do you distinguish between new music and old music when you're programming, or is it just all music? How do you put together what, in some seasons for you, is a really eclectic mix of programs?
Well, eclectic is a nice word for it. No, we absolutely don't think, well, this is a contemporary work and this is a classical work, from other centuries. We try to design an overall appealing program, and we also, there's something that we talk about here, which is composer heroes. If you look at the history of music in a time when so-called classical music, although I don't like the term classical, I put quotes on it because that really refers, as you know, quite specifically to the time of Mozart and Haydn, but arguably we haven't come up with a better term for it.
And old music doesn't exactly work either.
No, it doesn't. So in thinking about this, it was a flourishing art form at that time. What was the difference? Well, one of the key differences that you look at is that the hero was the composer, and in fact, the music that they played was all music of their time. Contemporary music was what people listened to. It was contemporary of their time. Eventually, over the 19th century and early 20th century, what evolved was the performer as the hero and the focal point. And so what we try to do, in essence, is to shift back, if you will. I mean, you could almost call it retro, but to look at the composer as the hero, that it is living music of our time that is going to define really viable, vibrant, healthy artistic institutions and musical institutions in the 21st century. So that's something that governs, how we think about things and how we put seasons together.
Chad, let me ask you a question about that, because the Philharmonic really has done an exceptional job of involving individual artists, composers, and performers in many ways in the organization, from the standpoint of writing music and performing music to curating projects in a variety of really interesting ways. How important is this for an orchestra in the 21st century?
Well, I think as Deborah mentioned, it's essential to kind of how we define ourselves, and I think it's essential. I think that organizations need to be essentially contemporary citizens within our own cultural communities, and the way to do that is essentially to kind of be a part of what is happening in the world today. So when we look across our many different programmatic offerings, the Philharmonic is at its core, we're an orchestra, but we also are the major presenter of all sorts of music within Los Angeles. We try to engage the most creative, the most innovative artists of our time to help us shape what we do. And I think that that's something that over the past 10 or 12 years has been really essential to kind of giving the Philharmonic its unique programmatic outlook. So obviously, we have John Adams as our creative chair. He specifically is called creative chair. He's not called the composer in residence. He's called creative chair because he works with us on all of our different programmatic offerings. We want him to kind of help us be a thinking partner, as much in looking at our regular subscription weeks as with our Green Umbrella New Music series. We also try to build in these festivals and special projects where we can, again, bring in kind of the leading creative artists, whether that is Peter Sellers or whether that is an avant-garde theater company or whether it is a dance artist, to kind of help us shape these mini projects. Sometimes they're just mini weekends of looking at a specific idea or a musical period, or some of our bigger festivals, which we call platforms.
That's great. I want to ask you specifically about how you structure your program planning process. We have talked about this with orchestras in some of the other podcasts, and the Fearless Journeys. Each of the Fearless Journeys chapters does talk a bit about each orchestra's approach to programming. But I'd like to hear from you how you bring together all these various elements. What's the process like? Who's involved in the process? How do you structure a process that keeps your values front and center?
Well, at the core of the process, of course, is our music director, Gustavo Dudamel, working very, very closely with Chad and myself. And we spend a lot of time thinking about things, talking about things. But beyond that, we have found it very successful here. And we started we implemented this 2 years before we opened the hall, as we were moving towards, you can imagine the intensity of planning for not only opening the hall, but literally we were getting ready to double the number of presentations that the Philharmonic was going to present. In our final year in the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, we presented about 95 concerts during the winter season, and most of those simply orchestral concerts. And in our opening year in Walt Disney Concert Hall, we presented, over 160 concerts. And in fact, as Chad mentioned before, embracing a spectrum of music, adding a Baroque series, adding a world music series, adding a jazz series, all sorts of recital series, etc. So what we found was that it was very important within the institution to really have different departments and different intellects and minds informing the overall process. So we have a number of ways, methods of doing that, and we have something that is called the operating committee, where we sit down with the department heads and we discuss, very specifically our programming ideas, what's behind them, how we're going to present them, what are the ramifications for the community. And I think that kind of stimulation that comes from conversation and from different points of view has been extremely helpful to us. Later on, maybe we'll talk about the board of directors because you have to involve them as well. But in terms of actually doing the programming, again, Chad and myself and Gustavo, or previously Esapeka, are very much key in a lot of the formative work, because I'm a great believer that you take people you have to develop ideas to a certain point. You just can't throw everything up against the wall and say what's going to happen. But then we try to really integrate it through various committees cross-departmentally. And in fact, we had something called the Inaugural Planning Committee when we were otherwise affectionately known as the IPC, when we were getting ready to open Walt Disney Hall. And we have applied that system to really everything that we have done. We also reach out to the orchestra. We have an artistic liaison committee. Chad and I meet with them on a very regular basis. And finally, because it's more than just your top management or even your middle management, it's an entire organization that has to absorb and be able to speak about and affect the values of excellence and innovation and all of the kinds of things that we undertake. So we 4 times a year have staff meetings, full staff meetings, where we have very specific artistic presentations and discussion, so that this is not something that is simply limited to the artistic administration department and the president.
Yeah, I think that trend toward integrating departments toward a single vision is something we've been seeing in a lot of orchestras, and you guys have been at the forefront of that. It's really clearly linked to a number of your program initiatives. I know, Deborah, you don't like the words identity programming for a myriad of reasons, and I actually would like to explore that a little bit, because I think it's really interesting. It's really more than identity programming. It goes beyond marketing. It goes beyond branding, but it does create. But you have been very successful in creating a distinguished artistic profile for the orchestra that is individual and uniquely recognizable. So can you talk a little bit about that? How would you describe your conceptual framework, let's say, for your programs?
Well, our conceptual framework is very firmly rooted in the 21st century and in looking forward. Our conceptual framework is very firmly rooted in what I spoke about before, our relationships, and Chad spoke about, with a variety of composers, Solonin, Adams, Sarajevo, Peter Sellers, Bill Viola. So there's a multidisciplinary approach, but also one very rooted in our time, and a really profound belief that our orchestra should be a center of intellectual discovery. And so if that is our identity within the nation, or certainly within Los Angeles, that's something that is very strong for us. And I think, oddly enough, what I objected to, I think, before when we were talking, before we taped this, is just, people use the word branding now. And there's actually nothing wrong with the word branding. It's not really pejorative, but it's really a marketing tool. So I suppose what you're saying is what we're trying to do is give a kind of intellectual branding, an artistic and aesthetic branding to what we do, and I do believe we do that.
Yeah, and I think that spills over into the kind of programming you've talked about, which is also sort of more than thematic programming. It's really based in ideas and concepts, and that's a subtle but I think really remarkable difference. And Chad, I'd like to ask you to address that a little bit. I know that the Philharmonic is now moving toward what you're calling seasonal platforms to deliver musical ideas and musical concepts to the community. Could you take us through the development of one of the projects you've either recently done or that you're planning to do this year, and demonstrate to people who are listening how it reflects your values, what you want it to say about the Philharmonic, how you imagine it would connect with audiences?
Sure. It's interesting. I think it was these platforms were born out of a unique opportunity that the Philharmonic has in being at its core an orchestra, but also a major presenter of all types of music. And I think as we moved into the concert hall and we were going from, say, 95 concerts in the winter, as Deborah mentioned, to over 160, we wanted to start finding ways that we could find those commonalities between these different series. And we also wanted to really kind of capitalize on Frank Gehry's desire that Walt Disney Concert Hall become the living room for the city. And what does that actually mean? It's a place where people gather. It's a place where people talk about ideas. And we really felt like the LA Philharmonic could be a catalyst for those kinds of discussions. But our seasons are also very unique. We have a subscription season, so audiences engage with us in many different ways. There's a certain segment of our audience who comes over the course of a season in a very kind of horizontal manner. But then we have single ticket buyers, and we have special projects that we do that occur at very specific moments within the season, almost in vertical, if you're looking at it on a vertical axis. So what we try to do when we create these platforms is take a topic or an idea or a musical period or some sort of unique question that we need to that we would like to answer, for which we think the Philharmonic and the orchestra and some of our other programmatic offerings can provide part of that answer. And we build on top of what we're already doing. We're building on top of our subscription series. So we'll say, for example, back in 2006, John Adams curated for us a festival called Minimalist Jukebox. It was one of our first and most successful platforms. And for 2 weeks, the orchestra played 3 different programs of music that was inspired by or kind of developmentally important to the idea of minimalism. But we contextualize these orchestral programs with our other programmatic offerings. So on our World Music series, we presented gamelan and African drumming. With our pop, some of our pop presentations, we created a midnight to 6 a.m. Event with an electronic group called the Orb. So from midnight until 6 a.m. on one Sunday morning, we had a very different population of people coming in to experience the LA Philharmonic, and specifically to experience Minimalist Jukebox. So it's in addition to those musical offerings, we try to create, we partner with other members of our community so that our efforts are amplified. So we will partner with the Getty Center. We'll partner with art museums. We'll partner with media outlets across the city. We'll do dance presentations with the Music Center. So again, there are so many points of contact with our audience that for that slice of time, there's a saturation within our community. And you say, what is happening at the Philharmonic? Minimalist Jukebox.
I think the use of the word jukebox is a really interesting image, and I wonder if it was conscious. I mean, you have embedded in that title, Minimalist Jukebox, are lots of ideas. And could you talk about that a little bit?
It's so funny that you hear Chad and I both individually chuckling at our ends of the line. This was a hotly debated subject. What were we going to call this festival? And when we're launching festivals, a name is very important. A name, it can't be underestimated, and so we developed a list with people we work with on this of about 30 names, and we went through them, and there was some controversy about whether Minimalist Jukebox was in some way trite and not serious enough for the undertaking. And the sense was, the way a jukebox works, that you put in a quarter or a dime or whatever, a nickel, I guess, in the old days, and you pick what you want and it comes out. It comes out and is played, and we wanted to say that, you had that kind of sort of, display or menu of possibilities, and you could pick and go what you wanted to, and it was sort of a catchy title, and John Adams liked it. Very important. He was the curator of that festival. Mm-hmm. And, of course, John has such wonderfully Catholic tastes and can actually say, let's get the Orb and do a midnight rave. But this is the kind of thing, I mean, that's a really great example, Kathy, because this was something we really debated and finally, reached agreement on, and I think later on all thought it was fine.
Well, it leads me actually to another question, because clearly that kind of debate and discussion really demonstrates how your programming is driven by ideas, and I can imagine you can get into hours of discussions about specific elements of any given platform. It's fundamentally very sophisticated and intellectual, and you use that word a lot, Deborah, intellectual. And so what I'd like to ask you about is whether you see any risks in that? As you are so deeply engaged in these discussions, how do you make sure that you don't lose or confuse your audiences who may not automatically see the connections you're making? Have you learned anything through this process that perhaps could be useful to our listeners?
Well, first of all, I would like to state that I still have my Minimalist Jukebox T-shirt, and I wear it proudly. I think one of the great mistakes people make with audiences is to underestimate them, to underestimate their ability to differentiate, their ability to be attracted if you provide things in context. And so I really don't, I think that is, as I say, talking down or programming down is one of the greatest mistakes you can make. Now we have made mistakes here, and we have had things that didn't exactly work out. But I can talk about some of those. But when something doesn't go exactly right for us, you know what? This is a learning experience, a teachable moment, as they say now, for us on the staff and for the music director, because we have had some things just not go as well as we'd want them to. They didn't live up to our dreams and our very high standards. And, we learn from those, and we shape and we grow as we go on. For example, we introduced a program, this is the year the hall opened, called First Nights. And it was based on the book by Professor Thomas Kelly of Harvard, which is about world premieres and setting them in the intellectual and historical context of what happened. And it's also a music course at Harvard University, and it is the single largest music course at Harvard, but you can only take it if you're not majoring in music. So it's training the leaders of tomorrow to love classical music and to learn about it. Great idea. We went, wonderful course. I knew people who took it. Went to Cambridge, worked with Tom, and we came up with an idea that we would recreate these through these sort of multimedia and very theatrically oriented programs. And it worked at the start. But what we found eventually was that although we believe in multidisciplinary undertakings, this became way too theatrically oriented. And we do a certain amount of focus groups and audience surveying, and we found out that our audience, while they love intellectual context and they want challenge, they also want music. We are fundamentally about music, and so we had strayed slightly from that. So eventually, we actually transformed these into our casual Friday concerts, which are shorter concerts, much more informal, having orchestra members talk, people dress casually, people love them, and that was very successful for us. But there were other parts to the success. One is that we went through this, we discussed it, we analyzed it, and we made a decision fundamentally to move in another direction, which has been very successful for us. But the second part of the success was that there were really good aspects of this program, and when the Chicago Symphony came out to see it, they saw certain aspects of it that would work with them. And, of course, they have an entire program that they've developed off this, and I have to say execute brilliantly. And so, to me, that was a real success.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think, something very important, which is your process for getting feedback and evaluating the success of your programs. Chad, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
How you do it internally and externally.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that we've learned is that we have to be very clear about how will we judge whether a project or a festival or a multidisciplinary new work is going to be a success? What are those things that we're aiming for? Is it that we want to really kind of push our audience and kind of give and really kind of take a chance artistically? Is it ticket sales? Is it that we want to kind of have a certain amount of kind of discussion created about these projects? And once we're kind of very clear about that, it allows everyone kind of to aim and work towards it. So that's been one of the big learning points. Not always, these festivals are not always the most popular, frankly. There are certain works on these festivals, or there are certain programs on these festivals that are hard, but they're important. And we, as a 21st century organization, feel that we need to be pushing ahead, and sometimes pushing ahead is hard. So it's been that's been a big moment for us, is to kind of say, all right, what are those milestones that we need to achieve in order to say that this project was a success?
Yeah, and we also talk about these as sort of pillars of the season. What is it that a subscription season begins at the end of September and goes till June. So how do you create vitality, peaks? How do you create this throughout the season? And so we call it pillars of the season. And one of the other ways we used to talk about it, a term we use for it, is London Tokyo. And what we mean by that, London Tokyo projects, and what we mean by that is, if you heard about Minimalist Jukebox, or you heard about the Tristan Project, or you heard about America and the Americans, this would be something that if you were in Tokyo or you were in London or you were in New York, you might want to get on a plane and make sure you came to Los Angeles to hear some of this. So this also contributes to the overall discussion, and as much as possible, one of the things we're concerned about is that so much of artistic life and musical life has sort of strayed from central discourse of intellectual discourse and media discourse in this country. So one of the issues we think about, as we said, in becoming a center of artistic and intellectual discovery is how we create awareness and frisson around these things.
That leads me to ask you some questions about audience and about staff and about board, and maybe the two of you can jump in as you see fit. You talked a little bit, Deborah, I think earlier, and Chad too, about how you get people inside the organization engaged in the process and how you embed those critical artistic conversations in your daily work. I'd like to ask you specifically how your audience has responded and whether you've been successful in reaching new audiences, and also what kind of support do you need from the board? How do you engage them in a way that enables them to feel comfortable about taking the kinds of programmatic risks that are so energizing for the organization?
Well, let me start with the board, and then maybe we can come back and talk about audience. There is our board, and I'll tell you how I think we got there, expects us to take risks. They define themselves as a cutting-edge 21st century organization. How does that happen, though? Because, of course, we often think of boards of directors as being somewhat conservative, and our board is completely aligned with this artistic and aesthetic position that Chad and I have discussed. How do you achieve that? Well, no board meeting takes place without a significant portion of the board meeting being dedicated to artistic discussion, artistic planning, the reasons behind what we are doing, the contextualization for the board. And the other part of it that we make sure of is that at every board meeting we have a performance as well. A performance either by members of the orchestra or a visiting artist or an informance where, for example, one of our most popular moments was when our principal oboist, Ariana Ghez, showed the board how she makes reeds.
Why did I know you were going to say that?
They loved it. That was extremely popular, but that's making, that's sort of the fun part of it. But our board is intellectually capable, of speaking in the community about what the mission of the institution is in terms of innovation and of excellence. And so it is not only introduced at every single meeting in two different ways. Once per season, we go on a retreat with the entire board, and there are very specific measurements that we look at and very specific discussions about aesthetic issues, artistic programming, as well as governance issues. So I think what you have to do is you need to involve your board very specifically in this. And by involving them, we don't, for example, have a board artistic committee. That doesn't exist because that is the job of the music director and the staff. But what we do have is engagement of the full board in this discussion and an attempt to, as I said, contextualize and get buy-in, and it's very, very, very strong. So one of the easiest funding calls we ever have is to try and get contemporary music commissioned or performed. So I think it's really making a point of addressing it on an ongoing basis and addressing it in depth.
Yeah. And I would say, from the audience perspective, these platforms have been opportunities for us to reach out to audiences which perhaps we haven't reached out to before. Because we have a very successful subscription base, there very often with our subscription orchestra concerts, we don't have opportunity to bring a lot of people into the hall on those individual concerts. So when we create these platforms, we're also trying to find opportunities to create non-subscription events where we can target and really open up the hall to new people, and we do that in a very very, very unique way. So for Minimalist Jukebox, we were looking at those cultural consumers, for a better word, who are interested in this phenomenon, minimalism and kind of the music of the 70s and 80s and how that related to the other art forms that we kind of worked with other partners on. But we can do that as well with some of our other platforms. We worked with USC on a project looking at the music during the Stalinist period. We worked with art museums when we created a festival looking at the music and urban music, and what does that actually mean? And so we can create some pop events, we can create some orchestral events that have open, that where the seats are available, and so that's one of our big challenges. The second thing I think that Deborah, perhaps you can address is, with Gustavo, we also have a very unique opportunity to engage a segment of our population which perhaps we haven't engaged with before, and that is very actively being pursued, whether on our orchestral series or at the Hollywood Bowl.
Yeah, I think people know about this now, but I'll just talk for a minute about it, as Chad points out. When we introduced Gustavo Dudamel as our new music director, which was actually just last October, we thought a lot about how we were going to do that. And actually, I want to even roll back further. When we opened Walt Disney Concert Hall, we gave very endless consideration to what our opening programs would be. And in fact, I was just talking to somebody the other day. I literally think Esa-Pekka and I went through literally 60 or 70 different iterations. It was a very iterative process. And we eventually came up with, what is now a sort of legendary kind of program where we started with a single voice and grew from there, mostly with 20th century music and culminating in an amazing performance of Rite of Spring. And it wasn't that was the opening night, but there were 3 opening nights. The next night was all 20th and 21st century music, and then the third night was about a community that we are very close to, obviously, the film community here in Los Angeles and Hollywood. So that was a different way of opening a hall. I remember when I spoke to some of the other managers and told them, that we were going to have Ligeti and Stravinsky on our opening program, they sort of looked askance, but it worked brilliantly. But then when the moment came to introduce Gustavo, we again went back and wanted to rethink, we weren't going to make a recreation of the opening of the hall. We wanted to do something that was different. And what was important to us was to focus on the broader message that Gustavo brings, which is the community of the larger community, music for all, and that the outreach that is so well known from El Sistema. And so his first concert, we made a very conscious decision, was not going to be a big, pricey gala at Walt Disney Concert Hall, but instead we did a program at the Hollywood Bowl called Bienvenido Gustavo, and we distributed tickets for, in a very specific system throughout the city so that, yes, our patrons and our donors and our board were there, although they weren't seated in the very best seats necessarily, but we reached very deeply into the broader community, and especially the Latino community. And when we had our concert, it was the real sort of festival which showed youth groups, leading up to the second half of the concert, with mentors, so Herbie Hancock with the Young Jazz Orchestra, etc. And then Gustavo's first notes that he conducted as music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic were not with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, but they were in fact leading YOLA, or YOLA Orchestra, which is Youth Orchestra LA, which is our American version of El Sistema. And the entire front of the house was filled with the families of the kids from YOLA. And it was just a remarkable moment. And then from there, we went to a performance of the Beethoven Ninth with, I call it a mega chorus, an enormous community chorus. And when we got to Ode to Joy at the very end, we had our super titles in Spanish as well as in English, and because we have enormous split, video screens at the bowl. And it was a moment where many people came to me afterwards and said they were simply in tears. It was just such a moving moment. It was an audience that, when they got certain moments when they became excited during the performance, they actually clapped in the middle of the music, which was an amazing and not disruptive, an amazing kind of thing. So that's another way that you can think about this and how you reach different audiences at different times and how you think creatively about it.
And how programmatically the offerings of the orchestra are reflective of the music director as we kind of go in full circle.
Yeah, I think it's obvious. I mean, Estefeka put an incredible imprimatur on the orchestra, and with Gustavo Dudamel, you're moving in new directions, still with very strong fundamental underpinnings, but exciting new possibilities coming from his initiative and his interest. So it's a remarkable transformation I think you've been through. We're coming to the end of our time, but I want to ask you one last question, just really quickly, about the lessons and experiences in all of this for orchestras that may not be as large as the Philharmonic or have its resources. I think people who are listening may want to say, how can I do this? Can anybody do it?
Absolutely. And as Gustavo says, and says very clearly, our tradition is the new. And that's what I'd like other orchestras, orchestral institutions to think about, how they can contextualize themselves in their community and in their time. Because, in fact, if we are vestiges of the past, that isn't a particularly bright outlook for symphony orchestras. And I think that, yes, you can talk about, well, great, they can do a gala at Walt Disney Concert Hall, they can have a free concert for 18,000 people, but I think this can be done very, very locally. Many of our projects weren't having to do, for example, with contemporary music. There was what Chad spoke about, the Shadow of Stalin, which was a festival, about the chilling effect that government and fascism can have on music and on artists. Last year's America and the Americans, where we had works that weren't 21st century works, they were 20th century works, and they were woven with popular culture. So people are only limited, I think, by their imagination and somewhat by being risk averse. So I think that what we do, you can do in your own way, in your own community. And I think that these lessons can absolutely be applied on a local basis, but it has to work for you and your community and your orchestra.
Well, let's end on that beautiful note of the willingness to take risks and the energy to use your imagination to do good and to make great music. So I want to thank you both, Deborah and Chad, for your generous and insightful participation. It was just great. And, of course, we hope your coming seasons are as successful as the past, and we look forward to following the journey of the Philharmonic in the future. For more information, we invite listeners to contact the Philharmonic and to read Fearless Journeys. Just a reminder, Fearless Journeys is available as a downloadable PDF as well as for Kindle and EPUB from the League's website at AmericanOrchestras.org.